Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the DigiMyth speaker series. My name is Kevin Cadena. I am a digital technologist, new media artist, and educator based in New York City. Um, I've been I was recently a Baby Castles resident, and DigiMyths kind of grew from that. For those of you who don't know what DigiMyths is a paid program on understanding digital folklore and how we can better connect to our heritage through familial storytelling and computer technologies. And so this, as stated, was developed during my time at the Baby Castles program and has kind of just grown beyond that. We had about 10 participants in the program who spent about 3 weeks meeting on Sundays and Wednesdays to provide feedback, participate in guest facilitated workshops, and then also learn software tutorials. Just to state, we have closed captioning provided. It's via the transcript button down at the bottom for those of you who need the captioning. You're welcome to turn your camera on, keep it off, whatever feels most comfortable. Please know that this conversation will be recorded. So if you'd ever like to view it again or share it with other people, you can do that as well. In terms of etiquette, you're welcome to post things in the chat and, kind of talk as you're seeing things that kind of relate to you in terms of in the chat and reflecting on, or if any questions come up, feel free to post them in the chat. Feel free to have discussions in the chat as kind of Allan is presenting. And I'll be presenting for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have the Q&A session. The first 2 to 3 questions will be prioritized to the DigiMyths participants. And then after that, it will be open, and I will start, going through questions that have been questions from people who have not been a part of the program. With all that being said, if you'd like to learn more about DigiMyths, I can post the link in the chat. And with all that being said, I would like to introduce our artist who we're having come in today, Allan Pichardo. Allan, as a digital artist, tries to find the hidden things that modern technology obfuscates about ourselves and uses code to expose them in their naked form through speculative software, repurposed and hacked applications meant to subvert the initial intention of the technology. He'll be speaking about his project, Follow the Drinking Gourd, which is an autobiographical exploration of his ancestors and his lost history through because of the Atlantic slave trade, through musical traditions that date back to the continent and ancient historical kingdoms. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome, use those reactions. Those are always great, to Allan. Woo, Allan.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk. My name is Allan Pichardo, and I'm a digital media artist and software engineer. I work primarily with artificial intelligence as my medium, just because I think that there's a lot that we can learn from ourselves when we're not actually intentionally searching for that information. A lot of corporations use machine learning to try to predict our behaviors so that they can monetize that. And I try to put that into my work as a way to subvert that in a way, kind of like take it back and try to figure out, like, what is this saying about me? What are they learning about us through our activity online? One moment. So I'm going to talk a bit about this work, Follow the Drinking Gourd, which is something that I've been working on for about a year now. And I was able to make a lot of progress when I was a resident at Baby Castles recently. Follow the Drinking Gourd is a VR game where you're standing on the deck of a ship and you discover constellations in the sky. And every constellation in the sky creates a path that represents the path of sound, right? Different musical traditions from around the African diaspora that are connected by the similarities between those sounds, you know, similarities in rhythm, similarities in melody, etc. This project came about because I had been doing a little bit of research into machine learning for sound, specifically Google Sound Search and how that works. And I was thinking pretty recently about things like Black history and my own personal history. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I am an immigrant here, and my background is mixed. You know, my father's side of the family is Black, and my mother's side of the family is white, and I, you know, when I had my grandmother around, I tried to get as much information as I could about our backgrounds, but there's always a fall off. And I think that this is something that other people might. Sorry? Oh. I think this is something that other people might be able to relate to, which is that a lot of people here in the Americas that are of African descent have a cutoff where it's difficult to trace back your lineage beyond what started here in the slave trade, right? A lot of the history that we know is very Eurocentric. You know, we're taught in school about the conquistadors, we're taught in school about the colonists, but very few people know about the ancient kingdoms of Africa where our ancestors actually came from, you know, in Senegal and Gambia and Congo and, Nigeria. Like, all of these things have kind of been erased over time. And the one thing that remains from all of that is our tradition of music. I think, in my opinion, African music is probably the most popular style of music in the world, right? Even in like modern pop contexts, a lot of these things originate in African traditions, you know, rock music, jazz music, house music, a lot of electronic music, hip hop, etc. So I was having a conversation with someone about the historical context of instruments. A lot of instruments come from places where the materials that these instruments are made out of, they're the things that people have around, right? So they're very closely connected to their way of life. You know, if you're a farmer and you have cattle, etc., then you might use, a bull's horns to create, an actual horn out of it. So thinking about these things, started to wonder, is it possible to reverse this AI algorithmic prediction And rather than try to predict what we're gonna do in the future, try to predict what we did in the past. That was the question that I was trying to answer with this project. So I, started by like reading a lot about Alan Lomax and his recordings and his writings. Traveled all over the world, and he came up with a taxonomy for music, for the music of the world, basically like trying to categorize how, what makes this, what makes music of the Americas this, what makes music African American music, that. And I started to try to correlate that to the travels of Africans in this continent. So when I talk about music similarity, I'm talking about very intrinsic things in the music. Here on the left side, I have a video. This is traditional merengue from the Dominican Republic. I'm gonna play a few seconds of that. Are you able to hear that, by the way? I think I forgot to.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, great. And then on the right side, this is music from Angola, right? And it's very similar. So you can tell that a lot of the rhythm is the same. I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship necessarily, but these are the types of things that I started to think about, trying to make a connection between these sounds. In order to use machine learning to try to do this for me, we need to have a language by which the model can actually understand like what we mean by the rhythm, right? And for that, I chose to use MEL spectrograms, because MEL spectrograms, they're a visual representation of a moment of sound over time, and they're scaled to human hearing, human perception, right? So things that are not, usually audible by human beings, like they're not in this image. Here I have like two sounds that Here I have two sounds that I ran through the algorithm, and it found to be similar. This is some music from Baltimore. And here's some music from Puerto Rico.
Cuando llegues a tu casa, ve y enséñale a tu nena y aprenda desde chiquita a jalar bien la cadena. La cadena.
So it's pretty broad. It's not going to be exact, but I think that there's something that I like there, because I'm not really interested in the things that I can hear just right off the bat. I'm really interested in hearing more of the subtleties and just letting the algorithm kind of like dictate those things to me and try to see where it goes. So one thing I learned working with machine learning in previous works is that the low dimensional space of a machine learning model has a lot of information, right? And it's always represented the same way. but it can be interpreted in many different ways. Usually, I'm gonna say this, and if there's any engineers in the house, we'll probably cringe a little bit, but I think that machine learning basically does one thing. It turns information into this dimensional representation, right? And here I have a very basic example. On this graph, there's 2 dimensions. And you can see that if you go on the x-axis to the right in the positive integers, then all these words correspond to honorifics and things like that. If you go up in the y-axis, then it's these gendered terms. That's basically what every machine learning model does, right? It takes whatever you put in it and it tries to give it coordinates in some space, hypothetical space. So I went to Spotify and I scraped a ton of music. I just made playlists for every country that I could find that had significant populations of African descendants in the Americas and all of the African nations that were subject to the slave trade. I took that music and I ran it through a model that tries to project it into space. And this is like a 3D representation of what I ended up with. Every one of these points and all these other points that are behind, they all represent music. These are all sound clips from popular music from these places. And they're clustered together based on how similar they are. And how similar they are is a little bit of a mysterious thing. Once you hear it, then you're able to identify it. But for example, like you can see here that we have like Angola, and then like right around it, the nearest neighbors, you have like Colombia, Trinidad, Dominican Republic, Chicago, Haiti, etc. And here on the right, the nearest points, it's just listed, what other songs have been discovered that are also very similar to the music of Angola. So this is kind of where I began. I'm gonna show you a sample of what the algorithm actually does. I took this information, I created an API out of it. So all of this is part of my discovery phase. So I had to do this just to know like what kind of stories I could mine from this information, So this is from the database that I mined from Spotify. You have a starting point. And then from there, you spread it. That's the same song. Oh, sorry. Here we go. end, you always end up with some music in the African continent that has similarities with all of these songs. It's kind of like a path, right? So there's two dimensions to this. There's the sound, the similarity of all of these songs. And then there's also the spatial dimension, which is like how far away in the real world are these sounds? You know, like can I take these sounds and make a map? Can I take these sounds and trace the travels of African descendants here in this continent? So this brought me to creating Follow the Drinking Gourd. Originally, I wanted this project to be very autobiographical because I was very curious about myself, you know, curious about my family and their history there. And eventually the project expanded to be for everyone. You know, I want this to be a celebration for all people that are of African descent. So I showed you the API and how, you know, sequentially it goes, you know, from like some point, some music farther and farther away from that point. The music changes until it gets to a point at the end where it's in the African continent. So in the game, this is how I represented it. You know, when you're navigating, you navigate with the stars, and, you know, stars make constellations when they're connected. It's kind of like what I started with, and this is what came up with it in the end. So you're on the ship. Every star represents a song that I took from Spotify. You get to use your own hands in the game. And you point at stars and it starts a sequence.
Western gorilla, wild beasts around me, they want to eat me.
How could you blame the colored man for making them blue eyes? And when he sat down at the president's table, he began to smile.
Ba 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 ba, ooh yeah. Ba 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 ba. Too long have been his slave. Thought it would be.
Ayita, ayita, anu de mama. Ayita, ayita, anu de mama.
Large. The capital ACCRA. Hey, it's only Friday. Rocks don't asylum.
Yeah, so it ends in some Ghanaian music. You'll notice that in this map, the map of
find them in the Caribbean. So just look how they, look how they, look how they, look how they chop. Dip and roll, dip and roll, chip and roll, chip and roll. All them got them mind it. I ride every time.
Meu grande amor, você me trouxe novamente o que faz.
So one thing that I found probably the most interesting about the project over time is this map that's generated over time. So this is intended to be played in a group with multiple people. So as people come around and they play the game for a few minutes, each person, over time, this map is generated. And it mirrors the map of the slave trade, basically. That wasn't a huge surprise, but I thought it added an interesting dimension to the project. So this is the sequence. This is an example of the map sequence. I can stop the video. So that's essentially the project at this time. There's still some more work to be done on this project. I plan to, the intended presentation of this is in person in a group setting. I think that would be when people would get the most out of it, when they're able to share the travels, see them in real time. This is paired with a website that's essentially the same as this map, and the map is made outside of the game. So when people are playing the game on the outside, people can also see the travels, and the travels stay there on the map. Keep playing. Sorry, guys. So right now, the only way to play the game is like if I send you a build, but I'm planning on releasing a version of this to for Oculus Quest. So if anyone is interested in playing the game, follow me on Twitter. That would probably be the best way to learn more about it. Yeah, that's it. Thanks Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Alan. Can we give a round of applause, reactions, however you all want to show love? Thank you so much. Yes, very cool. Yeah, okay. So I guess at this point, we can open it up for questions. Specifically at the moment, if any of the DigiMyths participants have any questions that they'd like to ask, we can start with maybe one or two from you all and then move it to just opening it up entirely. So I guess, yeah, Giselle, Teo, Samantha, if you all have any questions, you can turn on your audio and feel free to just ask.
Well, first of all, it's so exciting to like see the whole process. Like when you transitioned from the graph to then showing the game, like that connection was just so beautiful. And so I'm curious to hear more about like how you conceptualize like how to visualize the data that you were accumulating. Like, did you already go into it thinking about the constellation idea, or where did that, or when did that emerge?
That came after, before this project, I created this this other thing called Talking Head, and it was basically a chatbot pundit program. Basically, two chatbots that are trained with like political language from Reddit. They just talk to each other, so the output of one goes into the other one, that one goes back, and they just fight on the internet in like a weird TV show. When I was doing some research for that project, I learned about this idea of the low dimensional space and how data is represented there. If anyone is familiar with linear algebra, right? You can draw vectors between these points in space, and the relationships between the vectors, they actually correspond to relationships in real life, right? I'm just gonna share again to like give a quick example of that. So, for example, in this really simple, in this simple graph, like if you have a vector such as this, it goes from air to Eris, and you have a direction, that same vector, if you apply it to something else, you'll probably get the same relationship. In this example, it's probably not, it's not very good because it's made up, but you can say like, okay, I have these relationships, I'll just take this vector and just move it to this other word and find whatever other word is in that space. It's like an analogy, you know, this is to this as that is to that. That was the beginning. When I had the idea of doing it for sound, originally, it was very simple. I was like, we're just gonna explore the space. I'm gonna take all these points, I'm gonna put them out there, and then you can just fly around and go from like one to the other, you know? And then from there, it kind of developed more. I'm like, okay, what, you know, it's just too abstract, it's too computery, you know, it needs to be like real. So I'm like, okay, what about stars? You know, you're like looking at constellations, and those ideas just came afterwards.
Thank you for that question, Giselle. That was a very good question. Yeah, I guess Monica or Teo or Samantha or Stephanie, if you all have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
I have a question. What / who / where / like anything are you grounding your work in, or like what knowledge sources or like energy sources are you drawing from in order to make this work?
I think part of it, it's like I was listening to Holly Herndon a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but a lot of her recent work involves AI, and they were training this model to sing with a chorus. I was kind of impressed by that, and just thinking about like, oh, there's so many more things you can do, generative things that you can do with machine learning. And at the same time, there's just my personal curiosity, I guess you can say, or like just not being satisfied with like the stories that, my grandmother's stories. They just always leave so many more questions than I had when I begin, right? And those two things, I just kind of had to find a way to like turn this technology inside and inward, I was talking to a friend who's a performer, and they're doing their MFA on musical instruments from Brazil and these different communities and like the different materials that they make. And she brought up the historical context of the materials of the instruments. And then I just kind of like the light bulb clicked in my head, because I'm like, well, I mean, our music is everywhere. Our music is like a thread that has never been cut, like, why are people not looking into this more, when our history has been erased because, the people who write these books, they're not going to write them for us, but the music that our people make is always going to be there. So that's kind of where the idea came from.
Yeah, that's good that you bring up the Brazilian instruments, because that definitely came up in Digimyths at one point in time. Thank you, Teo. Great question. I guess one more from the Digimyths participants, if you all have any, and then we'll turn it over to just everyone else who's here.
I have a question. Yeah, what has this like project brought you in terms of like connecting back with like Dominican Republic and just with your heritage in general?
It's made me think a lot about the Congo Kingdom. A lot of Dominican culture comes from ancient Congo, which is now like Angola and the DRC. Which some of that I was already aware of just from like music from the Dominican Republic. Like there's a type of music called palo. Like palo is like an instrument. It's basically like a conga, you know what I mean? But it's like conga music. Listening to that music, listening to like artists like Sabu, it made me dig a little bit deeper into that and try to find like the connections to everywhere. It almost became like a little obsession in a way, because the more I use this thing, the more I could learn. Once I was able to like trace a sound reliably. I mean, it's not always reliable, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, but like once I was able to trace something, then I could read more about it. Think a lot of people don't even know the names of these places. Like these nations don't even exist anymore sometimes, but the people do exist. They're still there. And I think it's an incredibly rich culture that it has something to offer all of us, I think. So why not?
Very, very good answer and question, Monica. Definitely, that quote definitely is going to go in the book, Alan. Just FYI. Awesome. Yeah, so I guess I'll definitely open it up to, I'm sure that everyone else who's here has burning questions that they would love to ask. So for anyone who is not a Digimyths participant, if you have a question, please feel free to, ask it. And for those of you who are feeling awkward because you think someone else might like have a question and you don't know and you don't want to interrupt them, just like, I don't know, give like a reaction to say that you're gonna ask a question and then, ask your question.
Well, I will say that if you're interested in this work, Henry Louis Gates has been working on an archive of slave voyages. He's trying to, I don't know if you're all familiar with like his show, Finding Your Roots. He's amazing, but he's been working on this project, trying to find actual documentation and family names, like ancient family names, for people that came here through the slave trade. I think the website is slavevoyages.org.
Don't worry, Alan, I got you. I already posted it.
It's super cool. I recommend checking it out because there's so much interesting information there. Maps. It's depressing, but at the same time, like you kind of have to get this information. Yeah.
Cool. Other questions? People have any?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what do you feel is next for you after like completing this work? Like, are you interested in doing more like experimental, like experiential spaces and like in combination with music?
Yeah, a lot of my work has something to do with music in one way, in some form or another, because my background is in music performance. But for this one specifically, I want to show this in person because like I said before, I want people to share this, right? Share the experience. There's the outside experience, and then there's the inside experience in VR. And that has to be in physical space. I'm not satisfied with just like putting the game out there. I didn't really intend it to be like a video game. I wanted people to like talk about it, So I think that, once lockdowns start to like ease up, hopefully later this year, I want to present this in physical space.
So awesome, Artemio, and thank you, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was beautiful, the way that you made the visualization in the space with the stars. I really appreciated everything you spoke about. So I'm not sure if I missed this when you went over it, but in terms of feeding the songs into the algorithm, did you just set it up to just scrape like every Spotify song, or did you have a list of songs that you started with and fed into it? And just wondering what that process was like.
Yeah, so I read a research paper that I might actually have here. I have a ton of research papers on my desk, but I read this paper. You could probably, I could probably put a link like in the thing, but this is a medical research paper about, they do a long study of populations that descend from African slaves. They do a genetic study and they discover like how our genetic evolution, I guess, has changed since, has changed from continental Africans. And I found it very interesting because I learned things that I didn't know about some places, right? Like, for example, there's people in Honduras there's communities in Honduras that are that have not mixed at all with anyone, no natives, no Europeans, like, and those people are still around. They make music. So I'm like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I wonder what that's like. This is where that began. I basically took their map with their travels and the dates. And that's where I started. So I just made a list of these places and the dates. And then I tried to look into like what traditional music from these places is unique from there. And I made playlists on Spotify for every single one, you know. And then I went and made Spotify playlists for like all these other cultures. I'm like, okay, Wolof or Yoruba, you know, whatever, Congo. And I just like made all these playlists, and I signed up for the Spotify API, and then just download. They let you download like 30-second clips, and just downloaded all the 30-second clips. I don't think it's probably a violation of their terms, but okay, I don't know. They probably won't catch me. So.
Teo.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Artemio. Teo is asking, do you remember the name of the people in Honduras? And also, are the playlists available for us to listen?
The name of the people is Garifuna, Garifuna. Yeah. I recommend reading the paper. I mean, there's like depressing things about this paper, things that we already know, like the percentage of paternal DNA, percentage of maternal DNA. A lot of African descendants in the Americas have a significant amount of paternal DNA from of European descent, and we know that that's because, you know, slaves were raped by European masters and things like that. But I still found the paper to be very, very interesting. The playlists, I deleted them like 2 weeks ago, so because there were so many playlists on my thing that I just, you know, I was like, okay, I'm done with the project. I'm just going to delete these playlists.
Oh, oops. Thank you. Yeah, other questions? Elijah, I can read this out unless you would like to read it. Elijah is asking, did you draw on the cosmologies of these various ancient kingdoms in any ways when thinking about the constellations?
Interesting. No, I didn't. The constellation was a way for me to present that low dimensional space that I showed in a way that was like that a person could recognize. So it's basically a representation of the model in the sky. So it's like not related to anything real.
To follow up on the question, actually, just around the mapping, that what do you see as the dynamic between the constellation and then the like physical map? Because I feel like they're both connecting these points, but in like very different ways. You know, just like your thoughts on like, was it intentional, just the differences between them, or how you think about them?
Well, for me, it was just a way to represent movement and travel. That's why you're on a ship, right? And not necessarily a slave ship either, because it's not about coming here, it's about going there, right? So you're there, it's nighttime, you're moving, and you know the stars are how you navigate. So there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between that and the map. The map is the actual real places. The constellations are abstractions that are created by the machine learning model. So I guess you can think of it as like, you know, one is like this mathematical thing, and then the other one is like the real world version of it.
Yeah, because I think the one thing that I was thinking about with it was just that in the constellation, the ways that these things just like re-intersect with each other introduces this idea of like non-linearity within just like African musical tradition, and even the idea of a feedback loop. So we had a guest facilitation by Zoe Scruggs, who I can post the link to her talk in the chat, around just like how, you know, jazz came before, like, say, lo-fi hip hop, but now lo-fi hip hop is influencing the way people make jazz. And so just like, I think the way that these constellations just are like mixing with each other also showcases how they like influence each other, versus the map is like more of like a linearity of like geophysicality of the music.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great observation, I think. And that is exactly what it is, right? Because the model doesn't know anything culturally about these sounds. It just tries to connect them by similarity of rhythm or whatever. So like if you have like music, it uses a lot of samples from this, then it'll probably get picked up, and then it just goes around, it goes around in circles. But that's just the way that music is in real life anyway, you know? People travel, people go on tour, people like this or like that, they go back to where they came from and then they try to copy it, and then so I think that's really cool.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you for answering that. Another question from Maggie Chang. How do you consider the VR space in your work? Are the sites in VR space sourced from history or an abstraction?
Yeah, so I tried actually to get real spaces, because as part of this project, this slave voyages, there's a professor in South Africa who has been doing 3D scans of these forts, these ancient Portuguese or British forts in Ghana, where that's where they used to keep the slaves before the ships came and took them. So looking at those things, they're extremely, they're very detailed. And I thought it was interesting to see them and to be in those spaces. In VR, I thought that would probably add a different dimension to this work, but I couldn't get them. So I contacted the professor, but like he never got back to me. So in the end, in retrospect though, maybe it was a better thing not to get those. I wanted to make this work more of a celebration. A celebration of the diaspora and the traditions we share and the travels that have been made. You know, some of these 3D scans, they were just like very difficult to embody, and I don't think it would be appropriate for this work to like have a person be there in VR.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question, Maggie. Arnon is asking, was there any specific insights you've gathered from patterns in sampling, running motifs versus similarities in instrumentation used? Curious on your thoughts on that, plus the idea of music as a historical record with that context. This will probably be like, we'll probably make space for like one or two more questions. So if you really have something you want to ask Allan, please do it now.
I think this is kind of similar to Kevin's question from earlier, in that there is a feedback loop between all of these sounds. You know, there's the old sounds, right? Like sounds of traditional drums, congas, etc., that have like come here into like merengue, salsa, funk music. There's that line. And then there's the line that goes back over with like electric guitars and, you know, saxophones and things like that, which are like American music influencing African music. And you can see that a lot in like high life music from Ghana, or like Afrobeat music. It's very rock focused. I couldn't really find a reliable way to make the algorithm like distinguish between the old sounds and the new sounds. So I just left it there. So it doesn't actually go backwards in time, but it's still, the line is still there, which I think was cool. And music as
I kind of wanted to clarify my question. I guess I was thinking more about like the structure of a melody versus like the instrumentation and like the sounds that are used to make that melody, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I did not, and I don't think that this model would be able to do that, because the sounds, the sound clips that I have are too short to be representative of like those qualities, you know, which are a little bit longer term qualities, if that makes any sense, right? So it's all about very tiny intrinsic things about the sound, you know, like, is the rhythm like this, or, you know, or does it like, you know, or is it very rich and like this like boom 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 bass thing or whatever. It's like very micro, it's not so macro.
That good, Arnon? I don't know if he, yeah, okay. Maybe one more question and then we can call it quits. I know it's late. Thank you all for being here. I mean, it's late here. I don't know if it's late for Allan. So yeah, one more, maybe like one more question if people have any sort of burning final thoughts.
I have a second question, but if anyone else hasn't asked a question already, then you can go ahead.
Maybe like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1.5, 0.5. Okay, you can ask it.
Okay, cool. So I'm curious about, you mentioned talking to your grandma and like trying to source information about like your heritage from her, and that's something that resonated with me because I've been like recording conversations with my grandma recently and like doing the same thing, but then on the kind of in a similar vein, I noticed as you're speaking that your work is definitely very like research based, in terms of like academic research as well. So I guess I would just like to hear you talk a little bit more about how you negotiate like these different sources of information. So like really intimate oral history and then academic research, and then also like machine learning as a source of information, and just like how you treat the relationship between those different sources.
It's difficult to say because the work itself came from my dissatisfaction with the stories, right? Like the stories that I could get are like very specific stories about like, oh, you know, so-and-so did this on this day. Like some, you know, my sister did this, you know, at this time. My mom did this, happened to my mom at this time. But they're never like, I'm like, well, okay, but what about like your grandparents or like your great grandparents? Where did they come from? You know, or, you know, that is what prompted the research part. In this work in particular, it's the research. I think the research has a higher weight. The research always comes back to illuminate things for me, you know, places where I should like focus my energy. Yeah.
Awesome. And with that, yeah. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for taking space, for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to this talk. If we can please get a round of applause, you know, for Allan. Thank you so much for taking your time out to be here. Wait 1 second. Yeah. 1 sec. Can this load? Thanks, Thanks Allan. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so thank you all. If you would like to, thank you all. This concludes the first speaker series talk. If you would like to learn more about Digimyths, I've posted the URL to the microsite, digimyths.online. Next week, we have the second and final talk being led by Somnath Bhatt, who will be giving an overview of his work, starting with his background and how it has informed the way he currently works. He will then go into DIY ideologies and go through his process on his most recent projects and the way that mythology and mystification influence it. And if you need the Eventbrite, I can post it here if you want RSVP, or you can just save this, this Zoom link, because it's literally just going to be in the same Zoom meeting. So with that being said, thank you all so much for being here. Please have a good rest of your night, and I will see some of you next week, hopefully. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep. And I'll follow up with you about compensation stuff. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Bye all.